the main event, Ricky Carmichael. Chad Reed, the winner in Salt Lake City.
Everyone talks about the 90s like it was motocross heaven. Wild riders, wild personalities, the sport running on pure chaos and adrenaline. And honestly, they're not wrong. But here's the part nobody talks about. The moment the party ended and something colder took over. The 2000s didn't just change who was winning races, they changed what it took to even show up. By the early 2000s, motocross wasn't about who had the most style or the biggest personality. It was about who could out-train, out-engineer, and out-execute everyone else on the track. But the change didn't happen overnight. It happened through rivalries, technology, money, and a new kind of athlete the sport had never seen before. You have to understand what Jeremy McGrath meant to motocross going into the year 2000. 7 Supercross championships. Through most of the 90s, this guy was untouchable. He had the style, the results, and the kind of presence that made every other rider feel like they were competing for second place. McGrath didn't just win races, he made it look effortless, and that image was half his power.
I first met Jeremy McGrath when he was an intermediate. He was racing at the same races that I was racing. He was really fast, so I saw him all the time and I was impressed.
Then Ricky Carmichael walked in. RC didn't try to outstyle McGrath. He didn't try to beat him on charisma. He had a completely different plan, and it was going to change the sport forever. Carmichael hired trainer Aldon Baker.
The short story is, he said to me, what about helping Ricky on the physical side? The guy rides well, but we have some issues there. So that developed into an opportunity to kind of go on a limb with Ricky and say, hey, well, do we give it a test run, see where we're at?
And that decision drew a line between the old era and what was coming next. Baker didn't treat motocross preparation like something you figured out as you went. He built training programs that were closer to what you'd expect from professional endurance athletes. Running, cycling, structured workouts, year-round conditioning. Nothing was casual. Nothing was left to chance. The old guard trained hard, but Carmichael trained like a machine that had been programmed to win. By 2002, the results were undeniable. RC had put together a perfect outdoor season, winning every single moto at the Pro Motocross Championship. You want to know how rare that is? Winning every moto in an entire outdoor national season, not one slip, not one bad race. Every single race. And then he did it again.
I felt good. Sebastian was riding good. It's a good thing I got out front and got a good lead because he was turning, a little bit faster lap times than I was. And then
in 2004, riding the then new Honda CRF 450 4-stroke, Carmichael completed his second perfect outdoor season, going 24 for 24 in motos.
Ricky Carmichael picks up the magical 100. Undefeated in 2004 is Ricky Carmichael.
No rider before him had done it once. He did it twice. What does that do to the guys around him? What does it do to the sport? It shattered the idea that natural talent was the ceiling. Other riders looked at Carmichael and realized that if they weren't working at his level, they were already behind. The psychological weight of that is enormous. You're not just racing against RC on Saturday. You're racing against every training session he'd put in that week, that month, that year. Operating across 3 different factory teams during the decade, Kawasaki, Honda, and Suzuki, Carmichael secured 5 Supercross titles and multiple outdoor championships. The sport gave him the nickname the GOAT, greatest of all time. He retired in 2007 on top, on his own terms. The blueprint changed with Ricky Carmichael. Talent alone was no longer enough. But this shift didn't just create a new champion, it exposed everyone who had been built for the old one. Riders who came up in the 90s learned a different sport. They trained hard, but not like this. They were fast, but they weren't machines. When Carmichael raced the baseline, it happened so fast that elite riders suddenly looked ordinary. Again, the gap was not just about talent anymore. You could still have the speed, you could still have the instinct, but if your body and your program were built for 1998, you're behind. To survive, riders had to rebuild their whole approach, change how they trained, change how they ate, change how they thought about the off-season. Some just couldn't make that jump. This is where the decade starts feeling ruthless on a human level. The guys caught in the middle didn't get slower. The sport just got faster without him. What Carmichael started, the riders who came after him accelerated. Chad Reed arrived from Australia with a riding style that looked completely different from anyone else on the track.
Here I earned my second Supercross title. Starting next season, I would have to deal with Chad for the remainder of my career. I was totally caught off guard by Reed and was not anticipating what was to come. I raced against a lot of great and talented riders in my career, but no one ever raced me with the package of skill, speed, and tenacity that the 2-2 displayed every time.
Where Carmichael overwhelmed races with relentless pace, Reed approached them like a long game. He had a knack for keeping the bike together for 20-plus laps while everyone else started making mistakes. Championships are won over a full season, and Reed understood that consistency across an entire schedule mattered as much as raw speed on any given weekend. Reed won championships during this decade by capitalizing on exactly that. When other riders crashed, when fatigue set in, when the pressure of a full season broke people down, Reed was still there, still clean, still executing. Reed also understood something about racing that many riders avoided. Pressure could be a weapon. He didn't just race Carmichael and the rest of the field on the track. He challenged them in interviews, in press conferences, and in the way he carried himself every weekend. Reed believed he could beat the best rider the sport had ever seen, and he made sure that everyone knew it. In a sport where most riders tried to stay quiet and respectful, that confidence alone was enough to get under people's skin. And then, James Stewart showed up and made everyone look slow. Stewart, nicknamed Bubba, was riding the track in a way no one else understood yet.
I feel like James and I, right from the beginning, it was bad blood. You know, like it just...
Do you think it was maybe the age thing too? Because you guys
probably
are like really
age.
close.
We're closer in age. Well,
He started scrubbing jumps in a way nobody had seen before. While the rest of the field was still floating over jumps, Stewart was already back on the ground, driving into the next section. And once everyone saw it, there was no going back. The speed of the sport had just changed. The scrub wasn't just a trick, it was an advantage, and Stewart used it to pull away from riders who, by every other measure, should have been right there with him. The three-way battles between Carmichael, Reed, and Stewart produced some of the most watched races in the sport's history. The 2005 Orlando and 2006 finale in Las Vegas Supercross events are still referenced today as examples of what elite-level racing looks like when three completely different styles collide at the absolute top of the sport. Television viewership, stadium attendance, and merchandise sales hit heights the sport had never seen. But that speed came with a price. The bikes were faster, the rhythms were tighter, mistakes were more expensive than they'd ever been, and the outdoor nationals were even more unforgiving. Supercross was precision, outdoors was survival. 35-minute motos in brutal heat, tracks that broke down into endless square edges and breaking bumps by the halfway mark. Places like Redbud, Budds Creek, and Southwick didn't reward style. They rewarded riders who could keep the same pace when the track looked like it had been shelled by artillery. That's where Carmichael's training program showed its real impact. Late in motos, when other riders started fading, he was still pushing. Not because he wanted to make a point, because that pace had become normal for him. The human body had not caught up to what the sport was now demanding. Ligaments tore, bones broke, concussions piled up, and the competition gave riders no room to wait. You could take 6 months off to heal properly. If you sat out, someone else took your spot, and they might not give it back. Riders pushed themselves through injuries. They came back fast, sometimes too fast, because the alternative was being replaced. The 2000s didn't just reward speed. They punished weakness immediately. If you showed up at less than 100%, the field made you pay for it. In 2008, Stewart put together a 24 for 24 outdoor season, matching Carmichael's perfect record. That number means something. It tells you how locked in Stewart was that year. Not one moto where something went sideways. Not one race where a competitor found a weakness. Perfect.
I just didn't want to get to 23-0 and just blow at the last moto. And, the track was definitely tricky. It was really slippery, and, I made a few mistakes out there. And, I just tried to put some good laps in, just something where I felt like comfortable going with the speed and stuff. And still able to get the job done, which is, for me, was I was happy about that.
What the Carmichael Reed Stewart era proved was that the 2000s didn't get louder than the 90s. They got faster. They got less forgiving. The margins between winning and losing compressed to the point where one bad lap could cost you a championship. One missed line, one moment of fatigue, one small mistake in bike setup, and the race was gone. The sport wasn't improvising anymore. If you wanted to win in the 2000s, perfection wasn't the goalpost. It was the starting line. All that speed and precision had to be built on something, and the foundation underneath it all was an engineering revolution that permanently changed what motocross looked like mechanically. For decades, two-stroke engines were the standard. Lightweight, simple, with that snappy, immediate power delivery that riders had built their entire feel for the sport around. Two-strokes were what motocross was. Then the AMA changed the rules. To push four-stroke development, the AMA introduced a displacement advantage for four-stroke machines. Early four-strokes were heavier and less powerful than their two-stroke competitors at equal displacement, so the AMA allowed larger displacement four-strokes to compete against smaller two-strokes. The goal was to give manufacturers a reason to invest in the technology. In 2001, Yamaha launched the YZ250F, a high-revving four-stroke that immediately exploited the displacement rule in the 125cc class. A 250cc four-stroke racing against 125cc two-strokes had a torque and horsepower advantage that the smaller bikes simply couldn't overcome. But the machine that sealed the era came in 2002. Honda released the CRF 450R. This bike was different. They brought the bike down to about 235 pounds, which, for a four-stroke at that time, was extraordinary. Honda's engineers had specifically designed it to appeal to riders who loved two-strokes but needed to make the switch. Broader power band, easier to manage, genuinely competitive at the highest level. And the proof came in 2004 when Ricky Carmichael rode the CRF 450R to that second perfect outdoor season. If the best rider in the world just went 24 for 24 on a four-stroke, the debate was over. The consequences went beyond the race results. Four-stroke engines were significantly more expensive to purchase and far more complex to maintain. The backyard mechanic who could tear down a two-stroke on a Saturday afternoon was suddenly out of his depth. The sport got more expensive, it got more technical, and that shifted power toward the factory teams. Factory rigs became something else entirely in the 2000s. The semi-trucks that pulled into race venues looked less like motorsports operations and more like military logistics units. Suspension labs on wheels, full-service bays stocked with spare parts that cost more than the rider's entire bikes. The infrastructure around professional motocross grew into something that required serious corporate investment to compete at the front. That investment changed the shape of the starting gate. In earlier eras, a talented privateer still had a real shot to matter. You could show up, outride your budget, and make a name for yourself. By the mid-2000s, that window was shrinking hard. Factory teams had too much testing data, too much specialized equipment, too much technical support. They could adjust suspension in minutes. They had spare engines tuned for specific track conditions. They worked at a level no independent rider could possibly match. The grid still looked full. The sport still looked healthy, but the realistic championship pool got smaller. If you weren't on a factory team, you were racing for 10th place. The decade didn't just get faster. It became structurally unequal. The gap between the haves and the have-nots stopped being something you could overcome with talent alone. And then there was the 125 and 250 class problem. With the four-stroke revolution came a talent bottleneck in the smaller classes. The development classes, the 125s and the 254 strokes, became stacked with elite talent. Ryan Villopoto, Ivan Tedesco, Christophe Pourcel, Mike Alessi, and late in the decade Ryan Dungey were all competing in that space. The path to the premier 450 class was crowded and unforgiving. There was no easy ride up, which is exactly where Mitch Payton came in. Payton's Pro Circuit team became the defining development program of the era. If you wanted to make it to the 450 class, going through Pro Circuit gave you the best shot at getting there. The team provided resources, machinery, and the kind of professional structure that shaped riders into athletes who could handle the demands of the top level. Simultaneously, the Loretta Lynn's Amateur National Motocross Championship exploded in importance. Loretta Lynn's had always been the proving ground for young talent, but during the 2000s it became the first major filter in a formal development pipeline. Scouts, factory representatives, and team managers were all watching. Getting noticed there could determine the entire trajectory of a young rider's career. The sport wasn't finding talent by accident anymore. It was manufacturing it. Riders weren't coming up from backyard tracks on sheer talent and determination. They were being identified early, placed in structured programs, and developed systematically before they ever turned professional. That shift from instinct to system, from rebel to product, was one of the most significant changes of the decade. By the mid-2000s, the sport had a new kind of sponsor. Red Bull banners were hanging over freestyle ramps. Monster logos were appearing on factory gear. Suddenly, the brightest colors in motocross weren't coming from bike plastics anymore. They were coming from energy drink brands. While the racing side of the sport was getting more structured, the business around it was going through its own transformation. Red Bull had been building in action sports through the late 90s. By the early 2000s, they were expanding aggressively into motocross, attaching their brand to the athletes and events generating the most attention. They launched the Red Bull X Fighters series, taking freestyle motocross out of dirt lots and into global stadium venues like the Plaza de Toros in Madrid. Monster Energy launched in 2002 and quickly became a major presence in Moto. They understood the culture, the aesthetic, the attitude. Their branding fit in a way traditional corporate sponsors often struggled to match. What energy drinks brought to motocross wasn't just money, they brought control. Riders became brand assets, not loosely but contractually. What a rider wore, what they said in interviews, how they presented themselves publicly, all of it became part of a managed relationship with sponsors who had specific marketing objectives. A rider in the 2000s wasn't just racing for championship points anymore. They were representing an energy drink brand, a gear company, a tire manufacturer, and a bike manufacturer at the same time. The sport had always needed money to run, but in the 2000s, money didn't just fuel the sport, it started running it. By the mid-2000s, something had quietly disappeared from motocross. The off-season used to exist. Riders finished their race season, went home, and had a few months where they were just people. The party culture that had always existed around the sport was real. The late nights, the loose schedules, the sense that motocross was still run by people who did it because they loved it and figured the rest out as they went. Aldon Baker's model ended that. When the results that Carmichael produced became visible, every serious team started looking at training differently. You couldn't watch RC go 24 for 24 and then send your rider into an off-season with no structure. The math just didn't work. If the guy winning every race was training year-round, you had to train year-round. Baker's approach changed more than how riders trained. It changed where riders trained. Elite riders started shifting away from public tracks. They began using private facilities and controlled practice environments. The logic was simple. Repeatable conditions let you measure progress. Structured motos let you simulate race pressure without the variables of a public track. Privacy kept competitors from watching your lines or your setup. This was the beginning of a trend, not the finished version of it. It wasn't yet the compound era that would come later, but by the late 2000s, you could see the shape of it. The sport was becoming more closed, more controlled. Outsiders had one less place to get seen. Baker's approach spread across the sport. Year-round conditioning became standard. Diet became part of preparation. Telemetry data from practice sessions informed bike setup decisions. Recovery protocols replaced weekends off. The off-season became another phase of the competitive calendar. Riders became professionals first, everything else second. The media landscape shifted with it. The outlaw DVD culture that had defined the early 2000s, the Crusty Demons releases, the Moto XXX videos, the raw, behind-the-scenes access that made motocross feel like a sport that existed outside normal sporting norms, started giving way to more polished, more controlled media. Rider interviews got more managed. Behind-the-scenes access got more restricted. Publications like Trans World Motocross had spent the early 2000s bridging the gap between racing culture and the lifestyle aesthetic of skateboarding and action sports. High-quality photography, edgy editorial, direct appeal to the youth demographic. That work mattered in building the sport's image during the first half of the decade. At the same time, the biggest media shift of the decade wasn't happening in magazines. It was happening online. Forums like Vital MX and message boards on sites like RacerX turned motocross into a 24-hour conversation. Fans didn't wait a month to read race coverage anymore. They were breaking down races, arguing about riders, and spreading rumors the same night the gate dropped. For the first time, the sport wasn't just being covered by journalists. It was being dissected in real time by thousands of fans. And those conversations revealed something interesting about the fan base. Some fans loved what the sport was becoming. Faster bikes, fitter riders, tighter competition. Others felt like something had been lost along the way. The wild personalities, the unpredictable races, the sense that motocross was still a little out of control. For the first time, the sport wasn't just evolving on the track. Fans were debating what motocross was supposed to be. By the end of the 2000s, the image being built was a professional sporting image, not an outlaw one. Television coverage had followed the same arc. The Speed channel had provided the most comprehensive, unified moto broadcasting in the sport's history during this era. In 2005, Supercross landed a multi-race package on CBS Sports alongside the Speed cable coverage. the largest television distribution deal in off-road motorcycle racing history up to that point. Supercross was going into mainstream living rooms on network television. That kind of visibility came with its own pressures. A sport broadcast on CBS Sports didn't have the same room for the raw, unfiltered culture that the underground DVD market had celebrated. It needed to present something that mainstream advertisers could attach themselves to. By 2010, the system was complete. The amateur pipeline fed structured development programs. Development programs produced professional riders. Professional riders operated within factory systems that managed their training, their equipment, and their public image. Energy drink brands organized the sponsorship landscape. National television coverage delivered the product to mainstream audiences. The outlaw era didn't fade slowly. It got replaced, piece by piece, with something that ran on data and contracts instead of instinct and attitude. The 90s made motocross famous. The 2000s made it ruthless. And every rider who wanted to compete at the front had to decide whether they were willing to pay that price. Most of them were. But here's the real question. Could a rider from today survive that era? Thanks for watching, and stay wicked.